All right, I think we can get started. I'll wait a few seconds to make sure everyone joins and the technology is caught up with the presentation. Everybody is in sync. Everybody is online. Recording got started. I can see the participant number increasing. So that's wonderful. Very good. Well, a warm welcome to everyone. This is Andras Bonnet speaking live from Brussels. And this is the EPSO Linguistic Assistants webcast, broadcast live and recorded at the same time. So you might be watching this as a recording in a few days or weeks. But I do welcome everyone who's at the live session because you have the opportunity to ask questions live, which I'll do my best to answer. And as always, if there's no time to answer all the questions, then we're going to follow up in a Q&A memo or in other form or another format. But we're going to make sure that all the questions get answered. So I'm still waiting for a few seconds to make sure that everybody who wants to join the live session is actually here. And it seems it works fine. So just while we are getting started with this, why don't you do a little warm up and type into the chat box where you are dialing in from. So we all know how broad geographically the audience is. That is always helpful. And this gets you familiar with the Q&A form and the Q&A box. So hopefully that will put you at ease to ask questions throughout today's event. So type into the chat box where you are dialing in from so I can see that and get a better sense of where you're joining us from. So while you do that, I don't see actually any answers coming in. Is nobody typing in, or is there some hiccup with the chat? Let's see, I'll wait a few seconds to make sure. Oh, there we go. Okay, very good. So Hartmann, Pelle is from Leipzig, Alessia from Italy, wonderful. And from Lisbon, Italy, Brussels, Serbia, very good. India, welcome and welcome to the team. India just joined our team recently, which is wonderful. And then we have France and Brussels and Philippines. Alan, who also joined our team. This is also great to have you here at the live session in Croatia. So all over, wonderful. Thank you so much for being here. So let me get started with the presentation and say a few words about how this is going to run. And the chat button you have already discovered. That is great. If you have any technical problem or any concern with the audio or something else, I have Veronica in the back who is helping us with technical questions. She's going to guide you to make sure that you can hear and see everything as it should. But normally restarting your browser or using a different app makes the trick. And then you are going to be able to follow the live session. So with that, let's say a few words about the background. Well, I won't bore you with my background. You might know EU training. You certainly know EU training because you registered there, but you might know that I used to work for the EU. Then I have a book named The Ultimate EU Test Book. So that brings me closer to the whole EPSO universe and these kind of exams and all that goes with it. We're going to get into it in a second, but just to reiterate for those who may have missed the first couple of seconds, we are going to share with you within a day, well, perhaps by Monday, but we aim to do that within 24 hours, the recording, the full recording of today's event, just as we're going to share with you the presentation slides to use it as a reference. And then usually within a week, we also put up the transcript. So you'll be able to read my wise words and advice and description of how the European Personal Selection Office exams run for AST1 for assistants in the linguist field. So about our company, a couple of words you may or may not know. We have a very active and large community since we've been in business since 2008, perhaps even 2007, actually. So it's grown over 100,000 registered users. We have tens of thousands followers and those who are engaged with us on Facebook. Various Facebook groups also help for your preparation at specific exams. So this particular exam as well has its own Facebook group. So if you are on that platform, you might want to check that out. And then in terms of test packages, we try to offer the full range of preparation tools for EPSO exams. And that includes a database with over 25,000 questions. That certainly includes all kinds of test questions in 24 languages when it comes to verbal reasoning. And we have a huge collection of numerical reasoning, abstract reasoning, the linguistic tests, and all the rest. And I'll highlight these when I speak about the specific requirements for this particular exam, what you will need to do or what you will need to practice in order to pass. And then really the number of questions that have been used and the test questions that have been generated through our platform is really mind-boggling, 27 million so far. And there you also find lots and lots of webinars. So there are some webcasts like the one we're having right now, but there are lots of more workshop style webinars and recordings available as well, with really thousands of participants who watch them or taken part in them. And then in the end of today's live session, I'm going to share with you a discount code which you can take advantage of to use for any of our digital products and get a special discount. So with that, let's get into it. And as always, I encourage you to ask questions through the chat box, whatever issue comes to mind when it comes to this specific AST1 competition. And I'll do my best to answer those. Now, the usual word of let's say, legal disclaimer or caveat is that I am not EPSO. We are not the official word of truth when it comes to these exams. Obviously, we do anything and everything in our power to be as accurate as possible to make sure that the information I share with you is reliable and accurate. Having said that, if there's any conflict between what I say and what you may have come across, it's always the notice of competition that is the real source of authority or the real source of official information. So with that, let's get started with the application part, where I would just like to highlight the information that's already been communicated in the notice of competition, how many places there are per language. So we're talking about linguistic assistants. Now, for those of you who might be new to the EPSO field, you may or may not know that there are essentially three main categories of positions. So there is the SC, which is secretariat. Then there is the AST, that's assistant. And then there is AD, which is administrators. So this particular exam is for AST. So that is not a clerical job. This is not a secretarial kind of job, and it's not AD level, which is administrators, which is typically on policy making and a certain degree of responsibility and more formal requirements to be eligible for those positions. So for AST, I'm going to speak to you about the formal requirements, but just to get a better idea, this is a supporting role of those who may be translators or interpreters in the institutions and helping the workflow partly on project management, but rather on specific linguistic tasks that we will talk about in a few moments. So there are language profiles, as you can see, as you are probably aware. So there are quite a few. There are 6 different language profiles in this particular competition. You can only choose one. So if you are in the lucky position to speak, say, Polish and Dutch, aside from English or French, so let's say you're a polyglot speaking that many languages, unfortunately, you need to make a pick and you need to choose a language that is the most comfortable for you or the one in which you can express yourself in the most fluent manner. There might be some consideration as to how many places there are in those particular profiles. So again, if you are in that sort of situation and you're in a dilemma which one to choose, let us know. Happy to give you my perspective. But then again, I assume that most of you would qualify for one or the other of these linguistic profiles. Now, what are these? So as you can see, there is Estonian, there is Croatian, Italian, Dutch, Polish, Portuguese, right? Just making sure that I don't miss any of these. So there's quite a diverse range of languages out there, and you will pick one. The number of places available in each on the reserve list let's say, rather comparable. So it ranges between 10 and 14. There's not a huge, let's say, discrepancy that they might be seeking far more Portuguese speakers than Croatian speakers. So it gives you a rough idea. Now, it's not a huge number, admittedly. This is not an incredibly lot of places out there. It is, let's say, a medium-sized competition. So in perspective, or comparing it to the other competitions that EPSO has announced in the past months or years, this is a mid-range competition, maybe on the smaller end. This should not discourage you, obviously. So there aren't perhaps that many people who have the motivation or the information and the dedication to actually go through the whole process and in the end succeed and get that number of places. So everything needs to be regarded from the angle of how many applicants are there likely going to be and how many places there are on the reserve list. Now, as we talk about it, so what you see on the screen is how many places there are on the reserve list. And EPSO, as the European Personnel Selection Office, they do not deal with recruitment. So this is how many people will be placed on the list. And then that makes you eligible to be recruited into permanent positions, so-called AST1 positions, by any of the institutions. The chances are, when we talk about which institution you might be employed by, well, there might be more need from the European Parliament or more need from the Court of Justice or other institutions, but legally speaking, you can be hired by any of the institutions as long as you have succeeded in this competition and you are placed on the reserve list. So with that, application deadline, not to be missed. So 24th of May, which is a good month from now. Make sure that you do not leave your application to the last moment. You can already start that. You can save the draft. You can create a profile on EPSO on your EPSO page. Do not send that in the very last moment because there could be all sorts of hiccups and server problems and all the rest. So try to finalize that before the date. And you may have certain questions when it comes to some input fields in the application, some elements, to make sure that you are absolutely clear on what you want to answer to those particular questions. Now, the main issue is always, are you eligible? So do you have the formal, let's say, objective background or criteria that makes you eligible for the competition? And then there is the so-called subjective part, or the part where you actually need to go through different tests to make sure that you prove your background qualifications for these competitions. Now, let's look at the formal ones. There are general conditions, pretty straightforward, which is you must have EU citizenship, so you need to have the passport of one of the EU 27 member states. You need to have completed military service if that is compulsory in your country. Now, that's not the case in many European countries, but say Finland and Greece and a couple other countries, this is compulsory. So if that is needed, you need to prove that. And then there's the third one, that you need to meet the character requirements for the job, which is a pretty broad term. I honestly haven't come across anyone who may have been disqualified because of this particular criterion. Maybe that relates to a criminal record or something along those lines, but this probably is not an issue for any listeners and viewers of this webinar. And then come the language rules. So this is a tricky thing. Obviously, this is a linguistic competition, so language becomes even more important than for other competitions. Now, what are those rules? So you need to have a so-called language 1, which is independent of your passport. It's independent of your nationality. So language 1, which they require you to speak and interact in a complete fluent manner. So you need to be pretty much native level in that particular language. Now, you could really be Portuguese and have perfect command of Dutch, or you could have an Estonian passport and have perfect command of Greek. So again, these two are not correlated. And again, given how people move around and what their administrative status or their nationality might be and which language they might speak could be totally different. And it's nice that EPSO understands that. So you can pick any of the EU's 24 official languages as language one. And I say the EU's 24 official languages because if you are completely fluent in Serbian or in Russian, that is not a language you could pick. So it has to be one of those 24. And as you'll see in a second, language 2 has to be English or French, as long as it's different from language 1. So let's say in my particular case, I take myself as an example. I'm Hungarian. That's my mother tongue. And I could choose as language 1 English. Again, it's one of the EU's 24 official languages and nothing to do with my nationality. And as language 2, I could choose French. So again, entirely up to me how you pick and choose those. Now, perhaps one word of advice. And again, let me actually correct myself. And I think somebody Cindy pointed this out. I need to correct myself. Absolutely. And I apologize for that because I was still in the mindset of how it runs for all competitions, but not for this one. So I need to correct myself and make sure that I give you the accurate information. Language 1 actually cannot be from any of the EU's 24 official languages. It has to be one of the languages of the competition that you choose, right? So probably we need to edit out that part from the recording, but just to make sure everyone gets the right information, and apologies for that. So this one is actually a big change from other competitions, given that this is a linguistic competition, right? So language 1, just to reiterate that point, is one of the languages of the competition. So going back for a second to those slides where you saw these languages, so it has to be either Estonian, it has to be either Croatian or Italian or Dutch or Polish or Portuguese, right? So language 1 in this particular competition has to be one of those 6 and cannot be any other of the EU's 24 official languages, right? So just to make sure that you get this, because this is the exception from all other competitions that EPSO has announced, and chances are they will announce where you could pick any of those 24. So it needs to be one of those 6. And as I said before, language 1 and 2 must be different. So in this case, this is not really an issue because, well, if you pick Portuguese, that is certainly not English or French. Or you pick Estonian, again, it's not English or French. So this is not really an issue in this particular case, but it also means you need to have either English or French at a very high level to qualify for this particular competition. So thanks again, Cindy, for pointing that out, and apologies for that mistake. Qualifications. This is, let's say, point number 3 when it comes to the eligibility for this competition. So we saw the general requirements, we saw the linguistic requirements, and now we're going to look at qualifications. By the way, I'd like to mention that when it comes to languages, EPSO does not require you to present any proof of that particular linguistic knowledge. You don't need a language exam, you don't need like a TOEFL exam or anything like that. You do not need any formal proof that you are you command that language to that degree. Why? Because the very competition that you will enroll in has those tests, and it's necessary that you speak those languages to that degree because they're actually going to test that. So it's not based on documents or self-declaration or anything else. They're actually going to test it. All right. So qualifications. When it comes to qualifications, there are different scenarios. So the most, let's say, straightforward scenario is that you have a post-secondary education attested by a diploma, which is relevant to the duties which were lined out or outlined in the annex to the notice of competition. Right, so post-secondary education, they don't say university or college or anything else, because it could be a different kind, or it could be a specialized education, it could be something, let's say, in a different format, or that gives you a different kind of degree in the end, but it has to be a post-secondary education. So that is the nature of that studies, but it has to be related to the duties of a linguistic assistant. Option B is secondary education attested by a diploma. So essentially a high school qualification, a high school degree, a baccalaureate or some equivalent of that, plus 3 years of relevant work experience, right? So you could have any high school degree. I mean, most candidates would, this is a default, so they graduated from high school, but then they need to demonstrate that they have 3 years of relevant work experience to qualify for this particular competition. Now, I see that there's a question coming in. So in the application, we can choose a third language. Could we introduce any other languages? Yes. In that case, as it often happens in this kind of competitions, and I call it these kind of competitions like lawyer linguists or translators or interpreters or proofreaders, these are all linguistic posts. So often they give you the opportunity to introduce or mention a third language. Now, that third language typically can be any of the EU's 24 official languages. So as I mentioned earlier by mistake, so this one would be L3. So the third language could be any of the 24 languages, as long as it's different from the first and the second language. So you have that, and they might test that. They might have some check, or they might get you to sit some exam on that. Now, that often, let's say, enriches your profile. So that often helps your employability options and opportunities after you have been placed on the reserve list. So once you're on the reserve list and they say, okay, this person also speaks Spanish, and that is helpful for this particular job, okay, that might make you more attractive as a candidate to be hired. So yeah, that was the third one. Now, what is the next question? A university degree in law can be considered relevant to this specific competition. I'm afraid no, because a university, well, to the extent that it, let's say, it satisfies the first part or the first option. So it says post-secondary education attested by a diploma. So a degree in law is actually a post-secondary education attested by a diploma, fine, but then it's not really relevant to the duties. So being a lawyer is not exactly the same as being a linguistic assistant. So in that case, you would need to go for the second criterion that says secondary education, which you certainly have if you have a degree in law, but then you need to demonstrate 3 years of relevant experience. Yeah. Can you give an example of a relevant professional experience for this competition? Let's say you were a proofreader. Let's say you were an editor. Maybe you worked in a translation office and you helped finalize translations and do the necessary editing work. Or maybe you worked in as a what is it word? As a corrector, if that is what it's called in English. So, or let's say, again, I'm essentially very similar to proofreader. So that kind of work certainly qualifies as a relevant experience and certainly qualifies as fully matching the requirements of the job. Now, this is a somewhat subjective assessment. So certain jobs, you kind of need to prove your case. I advise you to look at the Annex 1 of the Notice of Competition and look there what exactly are the nature, what is the nature of the tasks that you'll be required to do, and see, okay, what is it that I had done in my professional life that kind of matches some of those specific tasks that are required of me. And hopefully you will find enough proof points to put forward a good case. But let's say if you worked in as a barista, or if you worked as an engineer, or you worked as a I don't know, a project manager for an IT company, chances are that's not going to qualify you for this particular kind of job. So you need to have worked with languages, with text, with editing, with publishing, with in a multilingual environment. All right, I see there are a couple of other questions. We're going to come back to those, but I want to progress with this part of the presentation, and I'll do my best to come back and follow up to your questions. Now, a couple of words on why this is a great opportunity. I probably don't need to preach to the converted, but certainly there are great benefits of working in European institutions, because that gives you the status of a European civil servant, a public official with quite a few perks and benefits. So some of these are attractive salaries. Now, certainly the term attractive is a very relative term, because depending on what the salaries might be in the country where you live, or where you're coming from, or what your expectations are, can vary to a huge degree. And by the way, as a side note, this causes great problems for EPSO and generally EU institutions to offer attractive salaries, which are just as attractive for those coming from Central Eastern Europe and those from Scandinavia or other parts of Europe, where salary levels are so vastly different. Now, the rough salary for this AST1 position would be around 2,400 euros net per month. And then there is a bit of variation depending whether you have children, whether you're married or not, or your partner or spouse has revenue or income, whether you need to relocate for the job to Brussels or Luxembourg. So there are quite a few variables in there which can add some additional benefits or monthly allowances to this particular salary. But aside from that, there is a full and pretty robust health insurance. Then there are European schools, which are free for the children of European officials, often in the very language that the parents speak. So there is quite a bit of linguistic flexibility there as well. That is certainly part of the package. And broadly speaking, many people are motivated by working for the international organization that the EU is, for working in a multicultural and multilingual environment, and having a secure job, a long-term job, an open-ended job. So all of those benefits are certainly important factors in pursuing this career. Right, now, where will you likely work? The answer is pretty simple and straightforward. Well, we kept Strasbourg there, but essentially this is Brussels and Luxembourg, where the vast majority of EU institutions are located. Now, the European Parliament's official seat is in Strasbourg, but there's barely any administrative staff based or located in Strasbourg on a permanent basis. So essentially, it's Brussels and Luxembourg, and depending on which EU institution might end up hiring you, will largely determine where your place of work would be. European Commission has several directors general, several DGs located in Luxembourg, but the vast majority of Commission staff is based here in Brussels. The European Court of Justice is only based in Luxembourg, and their linguistic service is there as well. The Council of Ministers is in Brussels, and they also have their linguistic staff mostly here. So again, there's a bit of variation, and you might have certain preferences or not. The cost of living in Luxembourg is higher, but then there are lots of pros and cons on that speak for living in one city or another. But then again, it roughly gives you an idea. And then there are lots of other EU agencies that are located all over Europe, and there are also EU delegations across the world. Now, they typically will not employ linguistic assistants. So that's why I'm not really mentioning that as a potential place of work, because you will not be placed in the context of this particular job in the US or Philippines or South Africa, for that matter. So essentially, these are the two cities where the place of work is most likely going to be. Which institution you might end up working for, as I mentioned before, it really is decided at the moment of recruitment. So this particular competition, like most competitions, would not earmark in advance which institution wants to hire you. So once you pass the competition and you are placed on the reserve list, that's when it's essentially decided which particular institution has a vacancy and has a specific need to hire a linguistic assistant in the language in which you have passed the competition. So it could be any of the EU's institutions, the ones you see on the screen, many of which I've mentioned. And again, place of work is typically Brussels or Luxembourg, depending on where the institution is located or where their linguistic service is located. And then how to get one of these jobs. And before I get into that, let me take another look at my phone where Veronica is kind enough to feed me the questions and pick and choose a couple of questions here. Veronica, if you could just mark the questions I've already answered, that would help me a great deal. So I will not repeat something that I've already answered. So here's one, which degrees would be considered relevant for the role? I think, yeah, it goes back to the question of qualifications. So as I said, post-secondary degree, certainly basically a high school degree. And there the question is, what extra specific 3-year work experience have you gained that you can present as a relevant work experience? I think your question is mostly on that post-secondary degree that would qualify you for that. And there could be, and again, I'm not a linguist myself, I am not familiar what qualifications are out there in the world which would fully qualify you, but I guess anything that's linked to translation, interpreting, again, what is the word? Localization services. And I presume that there are formal qualifications for that that enable you to be a localization expert. So it's a very, very broad field to some degree, because there could be many sub areas that would qualify you to this one. So I'm not in the position to give you a list that this is the kind of degree that will qualify. So if you have a specific question about your particular situation, contrast that with the nature of the job and the kind of task that would be required, and try to have an assessment. And if you're really, really uncertain, I'm happy to give you my perspective. So send a message and I'll be happy to take a look. All right, moving on to some other questions. Is it worth applying only with administrative and executive assistant job experience? Well, again, depends on whether that experience relates to any of the nature or any of the tasks that are listed in the notice of competition. So if you were an executive assistant for somebody that dealt with, let's say, supermarket food supply, chances are this is not going to qualify you. It's not going to be considered relevant work experience. On the other hand, if you were working in a company that provided interpreters and conference interpreting services, well, that sounds quite relevant to me, as long as the nature of your tasks was not about, let's say, booking hotels, but rather, again, the more linguistic, more substantive part of that work. So hard to say anything beyond that without knowing the details. But again, I'll try to raise your awareness and mention the mindset or the approach that the assessors who are part of the EPSO selection board will or would look at your application, and they would run it through that mental algorithm and decide whether or not you qualify. All right, maybe one or two more questions. Is the salary related to the country where you will be hired? That's a very good question. I'm thinking there might be some small coefficient related to the place of work. That is something I think we would need to look into, because I'd rather not say it with a lot of confidence, because I'm not entirely sure what the staff regulation says. What I'm trying to pick as an analogy, I know that when commission staff is posted outside of the EU, or actually even within the EU, let's say somebody is sent to the EU representation in Budapest, or EU representation in Vilnius, or EU representation in any of the EU capitals, there is a coefficient which they calculate based on the cost of living. So there they adjust their allowances and their salary based on the cost of living in those places. Now, whether they do that for AST1 in Brussels versus Luxembourg, I'm not entirely sure about that, but there might be some minor adjustment to that, but I don't think it's anything significant. Right, I worked as a university professor for many years. Is this a relevant qualification? Well, again, without knowing in which field you worked in. So if it was neuroscience, probably not. If it was, again, in the field of linguistics and translation and producing high quality multilingual documents and reports, possibly yes. So you need to make your case that this is a relevant qualification. All right, I see there are quite a few questions still. I'm gonna try to come back to those in a second, but let's cover the rest of the presentation. And the main question, perhaps at this point, once you've established that you qualify, you meet the general, the linguistic, and the qualification requirements, how are you going to get these jobs? So you filled out all the papers or all the digital, let's say you filled out all the pixels and you typed your best answers to all those questions, and then you handed in your application before the 24th of May. What then? So then comes the actual exam. So there might be some, again, algorithmic or formal checks to make sure that you meet those basic criteria. But then at one point, you're going to be invited to sit certain exams. Now, the application process, so you have this eligibility declaration, essentially filling out your EPSO application through a profile that you create on their website. You pick those languages, you submit, excuse me, you submit your application in those languages, and what then after the 24th of May, 2022. So what happens is that this particular competition has a so-called pre-selection exam. Pre-selection exam often would be referred to as a CBT exam, and CBT in this particular context refers to computer-based tests. So computer-based tests, which are essentially so-called psychometric tests. Now, many of you might be familiar with these, others may be new to the field. These are essentially so-called verbal, numerical, and abstract reasoning tests, multiple choice tests done on a screen. Currently, these are handled, or these are done in a test center, and these test centers are everywhere, in the sense that in every European capital and often in large European cities as well. So you can book your place, you can book a date in those test centers after EPSO has notified you that you are invited. And then there is also a fourth test, which is called language comprehension. So you have these 4 computer-based tests, multiple choice tests, that you need to sit typically in a test center, but currently EPSO is already working on a system where you could do this from your very own computer. So most likely not for this particular competition, but some of the upcoming ones, chances are those will be done in your living room, essentially on your own computer, and there are going to be certainly lots of safety checks and verification with your ID and making sure that you cannot open other applications and there's no one else in the room and stuff like that. But again, for now, it's more likely or almost certain that these will be done in those test centers. And again, there are even test centers outside of Europe. Now, I'm not sure whether for this particular competition, those will be available. So if you happen to be outside of the EU on the date of the exam, it might be a logistical problem because you need to do that inside the EU. But again, for many competitions, their contract with the company Prometric, which runs these test centers, it even extends globally and they have those places. But then again, I'm not sure that this is going to be the case for this competition. What happens there? Well, all candidates who validated their application by the deadline will be invited to this exam. So if you tick the right boxes and you filled in the right information and you are deemed qualified for the competition, you're going to be invited to sit that CBT computer-based test. What do these look like? Some of you may have already taken some tests, others may be new to this. Well, for the verbal reasoning, you need to take that in language 1. So that's interesting, as we said before, that it has to be one of those 6 languages, and you need to have picked one of those languages for the competition. So it's in language 1, if it's Estonian or Portuguese or Croatian, you name it, it is in that language, and it's a verbal reasoning exam. By that we mean it's not simply understanding certain words and not a vocabulary test. This is about logic. So it's about reasoning, making sure that you read the text and you need to draw logical assumptions, or need to understand the text and think a little bit about it, and then pick the answer, which is, let's say, the most accurate one from the 4 answer options. And certainly they try to confuse you. They might put their generalizations, but one of the answers talks about something specific, or they might put contradictory information, and then in one of the answer options, it's not entirely accurate. And there could be similar wording, which doesn't really mean the same thing as the answer might state. So there's only one correct answer, and you need to find that which fully and accurately reflects something that you read in the text. The problem, or let's say the challenge, is time pressure. You only have 20 questions and 35 minutes, which is not a lot because a text passage is sometimes 5, 6, 7 lines long, which is relatively long text, and then you need to read it fast and process it, and then pick one of the 4 answer options which you consider accurate. We have a lot of methodology webinars on EU training, live ones and recorded ones. We have free resources about best practices, how you can master this, what are some good ideas that you might want to try out. I mentioned before, we have lots of practice tests, and in all 24 official EU languages, we have verbal reasoning. So you can practice in any of the 6 that you would pick. So those resources are available to you. Numerical reasoning is a slightly different matter. So numerical reasoning, it's about data and number crunching. So you have 10 questions and 20 minutes. Again, 2 minutes per question is not a lot. You need to interpret the data, you need to find the relevant information, you need to estimate, and perhaps sometimes calculate. But often even estimating or guesstimating is enough, and it saves you enough time to find the correct answer even without actually calculating the very specific figures or numbers for the answer. And then you have the abstract reasoning, which is often the most dreaded exam of all. Now, here you have 10 questions in 10 minutes, so a lot of time pressure, and it's those IQ test style questions where you need to find the next item in the sequence. So you need to find by which logic these figures and elements on the screen actually turn or move, and then find the next one in the sequence. So that is pretty much it. Now, the good news is, well, let me get to the good news in a second. That was the teaser. But before that, let me just finish off with the test. There's the language comprehension one. So this is number 4 after abstract, verbal, and numerical reasoning. You have the language comprehension. Slightly opposed to the verbal reasoning, this is really about your command of a given language. So this is really about how well you speak a certain language. So it's less about the logic, though there's some elements like that. And it's more about your vocabulary and understanding the true meaning of a certain text. So this is more classic language test and somewhat different from the verbal reasoning. This is done, as you see on the screen. So they want to test both of your languages. So language 1 and language 2. So language 1, one of the 6 of the competition, language 2 being English or French, as long as it's different from language 1, but in this particular case, that's almost a given. And the time, you see that it's 12 questions and 25 minutes. So roughly 2 minutes per question. This is relatively easy. So let's say if you're an Estonian native speaker, this should not be really a challenge for you. Perhaps what's more difficult is really the time pressure and making sure that you're really, really accurate in your replies. So here, I'll give you a rough idea of what it looks like. So there's a bit of reasoning element, as I said before. So there's a tiny bit of verbal reasoning mindset in these linguistic language comprehension tests, but it's essentially about comprehension, it's about vocabulary, and it's about fluency. It's about truly understanding the meaning of the text. What did the author intend to express? Did you get the main message? Did you really understand what this text was about? And there is one keyword in it which really changes the meaning. Did you really get what that particular word meant? So again, for those of you who are really in full command, full control of a language, this should not really be a very challenging test. Having said that, certainly worth practicing and certainly worth familiarizing yourself with the nature of these tests. Now, here's the good news. This is the one I mentioned a few seconds ago as a teaser. So the good news is, if you got a little scared when it comes to abstract verbal numerical reasoning, so the classic psychometric tests, the good news is that pass mark is enough. What does that mean? Each of these tests have a certain scoring, as you know. So verbal 20, numerical, let me take a look. Yeah, it's 10, and then abstract 10. So that adds up 40. And the requirement is that you need to get at least 20 points, and that's it. So even if you are completely not into abstract reasoning, you say, this is so much not my thing, I'm not even going to answer a single question there, but you are pretty good in verbal and numerical, as long as you get 20 points in aggregate, it's good enough. So that's good news for most candidates, because in other competitions, there used to be a different system. I'm not going to confuse you with that system, but bottom line is, it's somewhat easy to get at least the pass mark, a 50% pass mark. And that's it, check mark. What's more difficult or more challenging is really the linguistic test. So the language comprehension test, where you not only have a pass mark, which is 7 out of 12, you also have a real competition. So they're going to measure you against other candidates. So you are going to be ranked compared to the other candidates. So I mentioned before that it's a relatively easy test. At the same time, you need to perform really well on this particular test. So you need to have at least 7 points out of 12, but it's not enough to get to the next phase. So you need to be among the best candidates in terms of scores to pass to the next stage. So here is a quick summary of this message. So pass mark is enough for the abstract verbal numerical, but for the language comprehension, it's really, you need to be among the top. Now, how many are going to pass depends on other candidates. So I cannot say you need to have at least 11 points out of 12, or actually, if you take a look here, so you need to be in the top tier. Yes, but it all depends on other candidates. So it all depends on how well or not so well do other candidates perform, because they will do the calculation on the basis of the scores of others. And they say, okay, the threshold is now 10 points out of 12. Or if you put the two together, then say out of 24, say 20 points. Yeah, so here you need to be among the top performing candidates. Now, those of you who performed well, who did well on these tests and ranked well, will then pass to the next stage, which is the assessment center. And the assessment center is not so much a place as a process. They will invite approximately 3 times the number of candidates per language. So you do the maths, you see there are 12 places on the reserve list in the end. Then you say, okay, 3 times that many, so roughly 36 people will pass to the assessment center. So when you pass to the assessment center, you have a 1 to 3 chance. So the ratio is 1:3 to be successful and be placed on the reserve list in the end. So that's a very good chance. That's a very high probability. And certainly for the assessment center, there's a lot you can do, a lot of preparation, and there's a wealth of resources we have on our website, free ebooks, tips and tricks, live sessions, coaching, training, everything is ready and at your fingertips, and most of it is available online. So we also, well, pre-COVID we did in person, we might do that again, but for now this is readily available from anywhere. So there's a lot of preparation, or a lot of preparation resources you can tap into. So what is the assessment center? Well, there are so-called competencies. There are 7 competencies that EPSO wants to evaluate you on. Now, these competencies like working with others, or resiliency, or communication, or accuracy and precision, these competencies are, well, somewhat abstract, but the way they evaluate that is through specific exams. And these are the exams you see on the screen. So there's a case study exam, which is essentially an analysis and summary based on a background documentation. And then there is the CBI, the competency-based interview, which is an interview with either a panel or 2 assessors, often these days done online and not in person, and not related specifically to your field. So this is, again, about your skills and competencies that they want to evaluate. And this is done in language 2, basically in English or French. So there's no assessment center, at least in this competition and right now, in Croatian. This is all done in language 2, as mentioned before. And then the assessment center has another task. So this is task number 3 in the context of the assessment center, which is called, let me read it, finalization of a text. So finalization of a text, and that is done in language 1. And I thought about this quite a lot because there's not much more information out there. Basically, there's nothing else that is communicated in notice of competition. And then I was trying to think a bit more deeply. Back then, in my past, many years ago, I used to be a lawyer linguist at the European Court of Justice. And there, obviously, we worked with a lot of linguistic assistants, so exactly the profile you are all interested in. And I was thinking, okay, let me read the kind of tasks that you'll be required to do and compare that with my own experience and what could this look like. And again, in all transparency, I'm telling you my best guess, but it's hard to exactly pin down and say, okay, this is how this particular exam is going to look like. So I think this is some form of proofreading, editing, style review, perhaps sort of a spell check, a sort of kind of putting a raw text translation into and turning that into a final shape, a final form, and that you need to mark up a text and write that. So again, this is my best guess. We don't yet know exactly what this is going to look like. Once we have more information, we might hear rumors, and our many contacts may tell us more about this. We'll let you know. But again, at this point, it's a written test and most likely working with a document which is quite comparable to the kind of work that linguistic assistants currently do in the institutions. And again, this is done in language 1. So to sum it up, you see here there are the general competencies, those 7 competencies that you're tested on by the case study and the competency-based interview. And then you have this specific, domain-specific one, the field-related test, the finalization of a text, where you are scored on a scale of 100, and you need to have at least 60 to qualify. But then again, this is usually insufficient. So they will add up the scores, do a ranking, and then the top, that number that they had communicated for the reserve list. So that number of candidates will eventually be placed on the reserve list. Yeah. So those who get the overall highest scores will be on the reserve list. And then once you're on the reserve list, then things get somewhat simpler because it has a validity, usually a year, sometimes 2 years, but then the institutions can pick and choose candidates, meaning you, and reach out to you and say, okay, here's a job offer because you are on the reserve list, you qualify for this particular position, come in, and there might be an interview, and then they offer you a specific job. So how to get the job? What do you need to do? Well, a couple of best practices that I would share with you before I get to a couple of other questions. Practice a lot and do not leave it to the last moment. You want to be consistent in your practice. Look at it as a preparation for some sports competition. You cannot really get in shape or get the expertise or the skills overnight. So that's something that you need to do on a regular basis and be consistent. You might want to form a study group or join forces with a friend who's also applying for this, especially if they apply for another language. You are by no means competitors. So try to have that sort of social motivation through teams or through groups, and keep up the preparation. I highly advise you to look into test methodology. Make sure that you read many of these materials we have put out there, because there is a method to it. It's not like some people are born with this ability and others are not born with the ability to crunch numbers or do abstract reasoning or pass linguistic tests. There is a method to it where you can improve your performance significantly. And then being persistent, not giving up, and doing lots of simulations. So with that, a couple of points I just leave here with our website and the resources. We have all these simulated practice tests, many of which I mentioned. The language comprehension, we also have that in 15 languages, and all of the 6 languages are covered on our website. So you can find linguistic tests and many of those in some languages that you can practice with for this particular competition. I suggest you check out the webinars. We have many free resources, webinars and recordings, a couple of pro, and all these resources are out there for you to use. There is the Facebook group I mentioned earlier. You might want to check out. I have the book, the Ultimate EU Textbook Assistant Edition, which is related to this competition. There is also another book for the assessment center. And then I leave the discounted here up while I take a look at some of the questions in the remaining few minutes. All right, do you provide an EU training language comprehension? Yes, I think I just mentioned it now. French or English as a second language in order to boost our recruitment chances. Well, if you really are, let's say, on par with the 2 languages, and it really doesn't matter for you whether you choose English or French, perhaps English, perhaps it might give more opportunities. But then again, it's so hard to tell. In some places, like the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg, they really are looking for French speakers because that's the main language of the court. So their speaking language is a huge plus. Whereas in other DGs, English might be more required. So perhaps, and I might generalize here, or I might be wrong, maybe showing or demonstrating you speak French might give you more opportunities if, again, you can choose between the 2, because the assumption is that you probably will speak English as well. So I think more people would assume you speak English if you speak French than the other way around. So if you're an English speaker, they might not immediately think that you speak French. But then again, you could use French then as a 3rd language. And in your application, you mentioned that you are also a Francophone. All right. How much time passed from one step to another to have the result? So as you saw, essentially there are 3 blocks. There are 3 steps where you do fill in the application until the 24th of May. Then comes the actual computer-based test. So how much time passes? It's very hard to say. Usually not less than 6 weeks. So at the minimum would be 4 to 6 weeks before you are invited to the computer-based tests. But then again, there is also a time frame during which you can book book your exam at the test center. So again, that might take another couple of weeks. And then the part number 3, the assessment center, there could be easily 2 months between the final date of the computer-based tests and the first day of the assessment center. And I say easily 2 months because in August, most of the institutions really go on vacation or things really slow down. So if the competition happens to be at that part of the year, again, that might delay things. We saw with COVID that there was a huge delay because the institutions had to move everything online as opposed to a physical assessment center that they used to have. So there are a lot of variables there, but hopefully it gives you some idea. Just one thing to mention, EPSO is not trying to reform the entire selection process. Plans have already been communicated, some of it, not everything. And one of their key aims is to speed up the selection process. Now, speed up might be different in the private sector and in the public sector. So it might be a 9-month process, maybe 6 to 9 month process from start to finish, which some of you may not qualify as speed. But then again, if you compare that to earlier efforts where it easily could take a full year or more from start to finish for somebody to be hired, this is a trend or an intention towards the right direction. Maybe one or two more before we finish off in respect of everyone's time. Let me pick a question. University degree in foreign languages and literatures can be considered as a relevant work experience. It would not be. As a post-secondary degree, I can imagine it could be considered. Yes, I can imagine that would qualify as a relevant post-secondary degree. But then again, yeah, I don't know where to draw the line between knowing a language and being a linguistic editor, linguistic assistant. So yeah, that there it has a chance of being accepted as a relevant one. Right, maybe one or two more. I see that there are some longer questions. I'll try to follow up on those after the webinar. There's a timeline for different stages I mentioned. And is talent screen preview in the competition? So is talent screener going to be used in this competition? Those of you who may not be familiar with that, the so-called talent screener is a set of questions, usually about 5, 8, 10 questions that you need to answer about your professional background. And then they evaluate your profile, your eligibility on the basis of your answers to the talent screener. Now, good news is in this particular competition, there's no talent screener. So that is not something you need to do. It's only the steps and the process that I outlined here, and nothing more than that. All right, could you find exam methodology that I mentioned? Well, I encourage you to check out the free resources part of our website. You'll find there tips and tricks and ebooks and the webinars and all the other resources on eutraining.eu. And if you cannot find it for some reason, let us know. We'll point you to the right direction. So with that, I will close today's session. Hopefully you could take note of this 20% discount. It's valid for 2 days. Make sure to make good use of it. You may as well share it with others. And all that's left for me is to thank you for participating. Say a big thank you to Veronica, it's her last day with us, and we are super appreciative of her work, her support, wishing her lots of luck in her next endeavor. So thank you so much, Veronica, in front of everyone else, and also to welcome India and welcome Alan, who are joining our team. And to everyone who participated or has watched the live recording, that doesn't make sense, the live session or the recording. So appreciate your time, appreciate your interest. If we can be helpful with anything else, do let us know, and we'll do our best to answer your questions or point you to the right resource. And as said before, we will try to answer the open questions that I didn't have a chance to answer at the live session. And again, you can send us an email or send us a message. We'll be happy to follow up and help your success, help you succeed, help you get into the institutions as a linguistic assistant. So with that, thank you so much. Have a nice rest of your day, and to be followed up soon. Bye.